Hello there. I'm Rebecca, 28 years old and recently married to Richard, a man 7 years older than me. But let's rewind a bit. Let me paint a picture of the day Richard and I first met. It was at one of those fancy garden parties our parents loved to throw. I was 18, fresh out of high school, and Richard was 25, the new hotshot in his father's company. I remember him walking up to me, a glass of champagne in one hand. "Rebecca, right?" he asked, his voice smooth as silk. "I've heard a lot about you." I blushed, not knowing what to say. "And you're Richard. I've heard a lot about you, too." He laughed, a sound that made my heart flutter. Hopefully all good things. We spent the rest of the evening talking, laughing, and to my surprise, connecting on a level I hadn't expected. It was that night that our parents, seeing us together, got the idea of us getting married. It took a few more years, but eventually their plan came to fruition. Before we got married, we signed a prenup. It was a simple deal. If one of us cheated, the other got to call it quits and walk away with $3 million. I had no plans of straying, so I signed without hesitation. I remember the day we signed that agreement. My dad, a man of few words, but with a heart as big as an ocean, looked at me with concern in his eyes. "Are you sure you're okay with this, Rebecca?" he asked, his voice steady but tinged with worry. "Dad, it's fine," I reassured him, giving him a quick hug. "I trust Richard and he trusts me. This is just a formality. Richard was there too, and it was he who insisted on signing this paper." "I don't want you to feel like you're being cornered, Rebecca," he said, his voice a little strained. "If you're not comfortable with this, we can discuss it more." But I just shook my head and smiled. "Richard, I'm fine with it. I trust you." He seemed relieved and gave me a warm smile. "And I trust you, Rebecca." That was the start of our journey. We got married in a grand ceremony that was the talk of the town. I was excited about this new chapter in my life, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing on the horizon. After the wedding, we moved into a beautiful house on the outskirts of the city. It was a dream come true, living with Richard and waking up next to him every morning. He was sweet, caring, and for a while, everything seemed perfect. Our honeymoon was like something out of a fairy tale. We spent 2 weeks at a beautiful beach resort, soaking up the sun and enjoying each other's company. But when we came back home, things started to change. Richard became a different person. He was distant, always lost in his thoughts. He would come home late from work and go straight to bed without even saying goodnight. We started sleeping in separate rooms, eating at different times, and barely spoke to each other. One day I decided to confront him. "Richard," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "what's going on? You've been acting strange ever since we got back from our honeymoon." He looked at me, his eyes devoid of the warmth they once had. "I've just been busy with work, Rebecca," he replied, not meeting my gaze. "But we barely talk anymore," I pressed on. "We're living like strangers in our own home." He sighed, running his fingers through his hair. "I know, Rebecca. I'm sorry. I'll try to make more time for us." But things didn't change. If anything, they got worse. Richard started coming home even later, sometimes not until the early hours of the morning. He stopped eating with me, and we barely saw each other. I started having suspicions. Was he seeing someone else? The thought made my stomach churn, but I couldn't ignore the signs. I decided to confront him again. "Richard," I said one night when he came home late, "are you seeing someone else?" He looked shocked. "What? No, Rebecca. I would never do that to you." "But you're always out. You never spend time with me," I said, tears welling up in my eyes. "I told you, it's just work," he said firmly. "I'm not cheating on you, Rebecca." But I couldn't shake off the feeling that something was wrong. Richard was not the man I had married. He was distant, cold, and seemed to be hiding something. I didn't know what to do. I loved Richard, but I couldn't live like this. I decided to do some digging. If Richard wasn't going to tell me what was going on, I would find out for myself. I started by checking his phone when he was in the shower. I felt guilty about invading his privacy, but I was desperate for answers. I didn't find any suspicious messages or calls, but I did find something that made my heart drop. Richard had been searching for apartments. Was he planning on leaving me? I confronted him about it. "Richard, why are you looking for apartments? Are you planning on leaving me?" He looked taken aback. "No, Rebecca. I was just looking. I wasn't planning on leaving you." "But why were you looking?" I asked, my voice trembling. "I don't know, Rebecca," he said, his voice barely a whisper. I need some space." One day I decided to talk to my mom about it. She's always been my rock, my go-to person when things get tough. "Mom," I said, "I don't know what to do. Richard's changed. He's not the same person anymore." My mom listened, her face full of concern. "Rebecca," she said, "you're both still adjusting. You're newlyweds. It takes time to build a life together." I wanted to believe her, wanted to believe that this was just a phase and things would get better. But deep down, I knew there was more to it. Richard was hiding something. I could feel it. I tried to shake off the feeling, tried to convince myself that Mom was right, but the feeling wouldn't go away. It was like a nagging voice in the back of my mind, constantly reminding me that something was off. A few weeks later, I gathered my courage and approached Richard. "I need a job," I said, looking him in the eye. He looked surprised. "You want to work?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. I nodded. "Yes, I need to do something, Richard. I can't just sit at home all day." He thought for a moment, then said, "I can offer you a job at my foundation. We help kids in tough situations. Would you be interested?" I was taken aback. Richard's foundation was well known for its work with children. I had always admired the work they did. "Yes," I said without a moment's hesitation. "I'd love to." Working at the foundation was a breath of fresh air. I was busy, doing something meaningful. I met kids who were strong and resilient, kids who had seen more hardships than any child should. It was heartbreaking, but also inspiring. The job kept me busy and kept my mind off the problems at home. Richard and I had our issues, but at least during the day I had something else to focus on. The work was tough, emotionally draining, but it was worth it. I felt like I was making a difference, doing something important. For the first time in a long time, I felt happy. But even then, I couldn't shake off the feeling that something was off. Richard was acting strange and distant. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I knew something was wrong. I was determined to find out what it was. Left with a whirlwind of questions and a heart heavy with betrayal, I decided to hire a private detective. I needed to know if Richard was cheating on me. It wasn't just about my pride, it was about my peace of mind. I couldn't live in the shadow of doubt, constantly wondering what went wrong. And then there was the prenup we signed before we got married. If Richard was cheating on me, it wasn't just a betrayal. It was a costly mistake. I found a detective agency in the city run by a man named Joe. He was an ex-cop, a grizzled veteran with a keen eye and a no-nonsense attitude. I told him my story, my suspicions, and he listened, his face impassive. "I'll do my best, Rebecca," he said when I finished, "but I can't promise anything. If your husband is cheating, he's doing a good job of hiding it." I nodded, understanding. "I just need to know, Joe. One way or another, I need to know." I remember the day he came to give me his report. His face was serious, his eyes sympathetic. "I'm sorry, Rebecca," Joe said. "I couldn't find any evidence that your husband is cheating on you." I felt a strange mix of relief and disappointment. Part of me was glad that Richard wasn't cheating, but another part of me was frustrated. If he wasn't cheating, then why did he leave? What was he hiding? "Are you sure, Joe?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "There's nothing at all." Joe shook his head. "I'm sorry, Rebecca. I know this isn't what you wanted to hear." I thanked Joe and paid him for his services. As I watched him leave, I felt a profound sense of loss. I was back where I started, with more questions than answers. I was working at a charity fund event when he walked in. His name was Daniel, the new guy. He was handsome, with a charming smile that could light up a room. He was smart, with a quick wit and a sharp mind. He was funny, with a sense of humor that could make anyone laugh. In short, he was my ideal man. But as much as I was drawn to Daniel, I couldn't shake off a feeling of unease. His arrival seemed too perfect, too convenient. I couldn't help but think about Richard and the prenup. If I was caught cheating, I would have to pay a hefty sum of $3 million. Could Daniel be a trap set by Richard to catch me in the act? I decided to hire Joe again, the private detective I had used to investigate Richard. I asked him to look into Daniel to see if he had any connections to Richard. Joe agreed to take the case. He started investigating Daniel, digging into his past and his connections. He followed him, watched his movements, and monitored his interactions. He was as thorough as ever, leaving no stone unturned. In the meantime, I tried to keep my distance from Daniel. It was difficult, especially since he was so charming and attractive. But I had to be careful. I couldn't afford to fall into a trap, not when so much was at stake. One day, Daniel asked me out for coffee. I was torn. Part of me wanted to say yes and get to know him better, but another part of me was scared, worried about what Joe might find. "I'd love to, Daniel," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "but I'm really busy right now. Maybe some other time." Daniel seemed disappointed but didn't push. "Sure, Rebecca," he said, his smile dimming slightly, "some other time." I felt a pang of guilt. What if I was wrong? What if Daniel was just a nice guy and I was letting my suspicions ruin a potentially good thing? But I couldn't take the risk, not until I knew for sure. A few days later, Joe came to give me his report. His face was serious, his eyes hard. "I'm sorry, Rebecca," he said, "but your suspicions were right. Daniel is working for your husband." I felt a rush of emotions: anger at Richard for trying to trap me, relief that I hadn't fallen for it, and sadness that Daniel wasn't who I thought he was. But above all, I felt a sense of vindication. I wasn't crazy, my suspicions were valid. "Thank you, Joe," I said, my voice choked. "You've done a great job." As I watched Joe leave, I felt a strange sense of closure. I had dodged a bullet, avoided a costly mistake, but I had also lost something: the image of the ideal man, the hope of finding love again. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but I wasn't going to let this get me down. I was stronger than that. I was going to move on and find happiness again. I didn't need an ideal man, I just needed someone real and honest, and I was going to find that person no matter what. I could have sent Daniel packing right then and there, but I decided to take a different route. I chose to play along, to befriend him, all the while making sure to keep my behavior above board, not giving Richard any reason to point fingers at me. Daniel, however, took my friendliness as a sign of something more. He started to loosen up, thinking he had me charmed. The irony was he was the one getting played. But I didn't let Daniel in on the secret. I couldn't risk him running back to Richard, so I kept up the act, maintained the friendly facade. One day I decided to up the ante. I asked Daniel to join me for lunch, making it sound like a casual discussion about charity work. He agreed, a smug smile plastered on his face. He thought he was making progress. We found a quiet spot in the cafe. "So, Daniel," I began, "how are you finding the charity work?" He shrugged, a confident look in his eyes. "It's good. Different, but good." "And Richard?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "What do you think of him?" Daniel looked surprised. "Richard? He's okay, I guess." "Why?" I shrugged, attempting to look casual. "Just curious. He's a bit of an enigma, isn't he?" Daniel laughed, clearly relieved. Yeah, he can be a hard one to read. We continued to chat about work and life. I made sure to keep my tone neutral, not giving him any reason to be suspicious. In the days that followed, I continued to play along, keeping up the friendly act and making sure never to cross the line. I was always on guard, always careful. It was a risky game, but one I was willing to play for now. One day, during one of our lunch meetings, Daniel looked at me with a serious expression. "You know, I've been thinking," he said. A chill ran down my spine. "About?" I raised an eyebrow. He shrugged, looking uncomfortable. "About us, about this thing we have." My heart skipped a beat. This was it, the moment I had been dreading. I forced a smile. "And what is it that we have, Daniel?" He looked at me, hope in his eyes. "I think we have something special." Guilt washed over me. Daniel was falling into my trap just as I had planned, but it didn't feel right. It didn't feel good. Still, I had to keep up the act, keep playing the game. I smiled at Daniel, a fake smile plastered on my face. "Yes, Daniel," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "We do have something special." Just like that, I had set the trap. The game was on, but at what cost? The Cold War at home with Richard was as icy as ever. We'd occasionally run into each other, exchange chilly greetings, and retreat to our separate corners. Most nights, he'd be at his apartment, claiming it was more convenient for his work commute. One Sunday afternoon, I dialed Daniel's number, lacing my voice with a warmth as fake as his documents, inviting him over to my place. He probably thought I was finally ready to give in to his advances. Poor guy, he couldn't have been more wrong. As Daniel stepped into my home, he was greeted not by a seductive housewife, but by my old classmate, now a stern-faced police officer. He'd agreed to help me out, and the surprise on Daniel's face was worth every bit of it. The officer checked Daniel's papers, and as expected, they were as fake as a $3 bill. Now it was time for my move. I offered Daniel a choice: stick with Richard and face the consequences of his fake documents, or switch sides and work for me. His eyes darted between me and the officer. After a moment of silence, he nodded. He agreed to my deal. Checkmate, Richard. With that, the real game began. I had Richard's pawn now playing for my side, but I knew this was just the beginning. Richard was a crafty man. He wouldn't go down without a fight. In the days that followed, I kept a close watch on Daniel. Despite his agreement, I knew I couldn't fully trust him. He was a wild card, a potential threat, but for the time being, he was useful. One day, I summoned Daniel to my office. "We need to talk," I said, my tone serious. He looked at me, a hint of unease in his eyes. "About what?" "About Richard," I replied. "I need to know everything, his plans, his strategies, everything." Daniel hesitated, then nodded. "Okay, I'll tell you everything I know." Just like that, I had my insider. My counterattack was ready. But this was just the beginning. The real battle was still ahead. Richard wouldn't go down without a fight, and I had to be prepared. This wasn't just a game anymore. It was war. And in war, there are no rules, only survival. Days turned into weeks, and I was getting antsy. I wanted to confront Richard, to show him I wasn't the pushover he thought I was. Joe, whom I turned to once again, had given me some advice. "Push Richard," he suggested. "Make him think you've fallen into his trap." It was a gamble, but I was ready to play the game. So Daniel and I staged a photo shoot. We posed in ways that could be seen as compromising, as proof of an affair. But we were careful. We kept the originals, where everything was as innocent as a Sunday school picnic. Once the photos were ready, I gave them to Daniel. "Give these to Richard," I said, handing over the envelope. "Let him draw his own conclusions." Daniel looked at me, concern etched on his face. "You sure about this?" he asked again. "Once you start this, there's no going back." "I know," I replied, a steely resolve in my voice. "And I'm ready." The very next day, Richard was all smiles at dinner. He thought he'd caught me, that he'd gotten one over on me, but he didn't say a word about it. I wasn't worried. I knew it was coming. I was ready. Meanwhile, Joe was on the case. He was digging up dirt on Richard, finding all the evidence we needed. He was good at his job, and I trusted him. Finally, Joe called. Richard had relaxed and let his guard down. "I've got him," Joe said, his voice rough with satisfaction. "I've got all the proof of Richard's cheating, photos, videos, the whole shebang." I felt a rush of excitement. "Good," I said, a smile spreading across my face. "Let's bring him down." But I didn't confront Richard, not yet. I wanted him to think he was winning. I wanted to see the look on his face when he realized he'd been played. So I waited. I played the part of the dutiful wife, waiting for Richard to make his move. I knew what was coming and I was ready. The clock was ticking toward the family dinner. I knew this was it, the showdown. I felt a strange calmness. I was ready. The dinner was at Richard's parents' mansion, a sprawling estate that reeked of old money. Richard was there, of course, playing the doting son and husband, but I knew the truth, and soon everyone else would too. We were halfway through the main course when Richard cleared his throat. He stood up, a smug smile playing on his lips. "I have something to say," he announced, his eyes on me. He pulled out a set of photos of me with Daniel. He tossed them on the table like he was playing a winning hand. "Proof," he said, his voice filled with triumph, "of my wife's infidelity." The room went quiet. I could feel everyone's eyes on me, but I didn't flinch. I was ready for this. I calmly stood up, meeting Richard's gaze. "Yes," I said, my voice steady. "I know this man, but he's not my lover. He's an actor hired by you, Richard, to frame me." I pulled out my phone and hit play. The room filled with Daniel's voice, confessing everything. Richard's smile faltered, his eyes widened in shock. But I wasn't done. I pulled out my own set of photos and videos, evidence of Richard's own affairs. I tossed them on the table. "What about these, Richard?" I asked, my voice cold. "Can you explain them?" Richard stammered, trying to deny it, but the evidence was undeniable. His parents' faces turned to stone. My parents, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. "You ungrateful brat," my father roared at Richard. "We trusted you with our daughter, and this is how you repay us." Richard's mother was in tears. "How could you, Richard?" she sobbed. "How could you do this to us?" Her. The aftermath was swift. We divorced. Richard's parents, furious at their son's deceit, fired him from their company. His reputation was in tatters. And me? I walked away with $3 million in compensation. Now Richard is jobless, scrambling to pick up the pieces of his life. And me? I'm free. I'm enjoying the peace, the silence. I'm enjoying my life without Richard. I won. I took on Richard and won. I outsmarted him, played his own game better than he did, and it feels good. It feels right.
Again? They were just here last month. My voice trembled with a mix of anger and disbelief as I confronted Martin, my husband of 3 years. Martin, with his typical dismissive wave, dropped his briefcase by the door. "Evelyn, they're my parents. They want to see Lily, and it's only for a couple of weeks." I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. This wasn't just about his parents visiting. It was about respect, or the lack thereof. Martin had a habit of making decisions without consulting me, treating me more like a tenant than his wife. "Evelyn, you're overreacting," Martin said, his tone laced with condescension as he walked past me. "Just make sure the guest room is ready." I stood there, frozen, as he dismissed my feelings with such ease. It was always the same pattern. His parents, Miriam and Gerald, would arrive, turning our home upside down, leaving me to cater to their every whim, while Martin buried himself in work, conveniently absent. As I prepared the guest room, my mind raced with resentment. I thought back to the days before we were married, when Martin was considerate and kind. But since Lily's birth and our move to the suburbs, he had become increasingly domineering and detached. The next morning, I heard the familiar rumble of Miriam and Gerald's car in the driveway. I plastered a smile on my face as I opened the door. "Good morning, Miriam. Geraldcome?" "Ah, there she is, our lovely daughter-in-law," Miriam exclaimed, brushing past me to fuss over Lily, who clung to my leg, eyeing her grandparents warily. Gerald followed, carrying their bags. "We're so happy to be here. Where should we put these?" "Just in the guest room, thank you," I replied, my smile straining. The first few days passed in a blur of cooking, cleaning, and forced pleasantries. Martin came home late each night, barely acknowledging me or his parents. I felt invisible in my own home. One evening, as I was setting the table for dinner, Gerald called out from the living room. "Evelyn, where's the remote? The news is about to start." "It's right there on the coffee table, Gerald," I replied, trying to keep the irritation out of my voice. Miriam chimed in. "Evelyn, dear, could you bring us some tea? Gerald loves your tea." Suppressing a sigh, I nodded and headed to the kitchen. As the water boiled, I could hear them laughing and chatting in the living room, a stark contrast to the silence that filled the rest of the house. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I found myself sitting in the dark kitchen, a cup of untouched tea in my hands. Tears streamed down my face as I realized how lonely and unappreciated I felt. I missed the partnership I thought I had with Martin, the love that seemed to have evaporated since Lily's arrival. I wiped away my tears, a resolve building within me. I couldn't continue living like this, invisible and unheard. I needed to find a way to make Martin see me, to acknowledge my feelings. But deep down, I feared that the man I had married was gone, replaced by this cold, indifferent stranger. As I headed to bed, I made a silent vow to myself. I wouldn't let this go on any longer. I had to find my voice again, for my sake and for Lily's. The days turned into a monotonous blur with Miriam and Gerald's presence in the house. Their demands grew each day, yet Martin remained oblivious to the mounting pressure on me. I felt like a puppet, dancing to their every whim, my own needs and desires shoved aside. One particularly grueling evening, as I cleared the dinner plates while everyone else lounged in the living room, Martin's voice sliced through the air. "Evelyn, did you remember to pick up my dry cleaning?" I paused, the weight of the plates heavy in my hands. "No, Martin, I couldn't. I had to take Lily to her doctor's appointment today." A huff of annoyance came from him. "You could have gone after that. I needed that suit for tomorrow." The room fell silent, the tension palpable. Miriam and Gerald exchanged glances, an unspoken judgment passing between them. I felt a surge of anger, but I bit back my retort. This wasn't the time. The next morning, I found Martin in the kitchen, his demeanor icy. "We need to talk about your attitude, Evelyn," he began, his tone patronizing. "My attitude?" I echoed, incredulity lacing my voice. "Yes, you're not being accommodating enough to my parents. They've noticed it too." "It's embarrassing," he said, fixing me with a cold stare. I felt a rush of frustration. "Martin, I'm doing everything I can. I'm taking care of Lily, the house, your parents." He cut me off with a wave of his hand. "That's what you're supposed to do. You're the woman of the house. My parents shouldn't feel unwelcome." His words stung, a stark reminder of how little he valued my efforts. I wanted to scream, to make him see how unfair this was, but I knew it would only fall on deaf ears. As the days passed, my resolve hardened. I couldn't let Martin and his parents treat me like this any longer. I began to plan, to think of ways to stand up for myself, to reclaim my dignity. The opportunity came unexpectedly. One afternoon, while Martin was at work and Miriam and Gerald were napping, I received a phone call from my old friend Laura. "Evelyn, how have you been? I feel like it's been ages since we last talked." Laura's voice was a balm to my frayed nerves. "Laura, it's so good to hear your voice," I replied, my voice heavy with emotion. We talked about everything and nothing, and for a brief moment I felt like my old self again. Then Laura's tone shifted. "Evelyn, there's something I need to tell you. It's about Martin." My heart skipped a beat. "What about him?" "I saw him the other day with someone. A woman. They seemed close. More than just colleagues." The room spun around me as Laura's words sank in. A sickening feeling settled in my stomach. Could Martin be having an affair? "I'm sorry, Evelyn." I thought you should know, Laura added softly. The call ended, but her words echoed in my mind. The pieces began to fall into place, the late nights, the detached behavior, the lack of intimacy. I was faced with a harsh truth. My marriage was a sham, and I had been living in a fool's paradise. But I wasn't going to be the victim any longer. I would confront Martin, demand the truth, and if he was indeed betraying me, I would make him pay for every tear, every moment of pain he had caused me. That night, I lay in bed, my mind racing with plans of confrontation and revenge. I would no longer be the silent, suffering wife. It was time for Martin to see the strength he had underestimated in me. The days following Laura's revelation were a tempest of emotions. I observed Martin with a new lens, each of his dismissive remarks and arrogant gestures fueling my growing resentment. The man I once loved had become a stranger, his facade now transparent to my scrutinizing eyes. One evening, as I prepared Lily's dinner, Martin sauntered into the kitchen. "Evelyn, my parents are thinking of extending their stay. You don't mind, do you?" His question, so casually delivered, was a clear testament to his disregard for my feelings. "Extend their stay?" I repeated, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "Martin, don't you think they've stayed long enough?" Martin's face hardened. "What's that supposed to mean? They're my parents. You should be more welcoming." I turned to face him, my frustration reaching its boiling point. "Welcoming? Martin, I've been nothing but accommodating. But this is our home too. I have a say in this." He scoffed. "Your say? Look, Evelyn, you're the wife. It's your duty to take care of the household. My parents staying here shouldn't be an issue." His words struck a nerve. "Duty? Is that all I am to you? A caretaker?" Martin's eyes narrowed. "Don't start with this nonsense, Evelyn. You're being irrational." "Irrational?" I could feel my voice rising, the pent-up anger and hurt pouring out. "I'm the one being irrational? What about your late nights, your secret rendezvous? Are those rational?" For a moment Martin seemed taken aback, but he quickly regained his composure. "What are you talking about?" "Don't play dumb, Martin. I know about the other woman. Laura saw you." His face went pale, then flushed with anger. "You're spying on me now? How dare you?" "I'm not spying. I'm opening my eyes to the truth. The truth you've been hiding from me," I shot back, my resolve strengthening. Martin took a step closer, his voice low and menacing. "Listen, Evelyn, you better watch your tone. You have no idea what you're talking about." But I wasn't intimidated. "No, Martin, I know exactly what I'm talking about, and I won't stand for this any longer." He scoffed, turning to leave the kitchen. "Do what you want, just make sure my parents are comfortable." That night, after Martin had retreated to his den and Miriam and Gerald had retired to their room, I sat alone in the living room. The house was silent, but my mind was a cacophony of thoughts. I realized then that my marriage was beyond salvaging. Martin had not only betrayed me, but had also devalued me, treating me as nothing more than a servant in my own home. It was time for me to take a stand, to reclaim my life. I would no longer be a victim of Martin's arrogance and infidelity. I would gather evidence of his affair, consult a lawyer, and prepare for a divorce. But it wouldn't end there. Martin would have to face the consequences of his actions. I would ensure that he paid for the pain he had caused me, both emotionally and legally. As I lay in bed that night, a plan began to form in my mind. A plan not just for my escape, but for my retribution. Martin and his parents would soon learn that I was not a woman to be trifled with. The following days were a careful dance of deception and planning. I maintained a semblance of normalcy, all the while gathering evidence of Martin's infidelity. Laura had been right. A few discreet inquiries revealed Martin's secret meetings with a woman named Rachel, a colleague from his office. One evening, as we sat at the dinner table with his parents, Martin announced, "I might need to go on a business trip next weekend." A business trip? The perfect alibi for his affair. I looked at him, my expression neutral, but inside, a storm was brewing. "That sounds important, Martin. I hope it goes well," I said, my voice laced with hidden irony. Miriam chimed in, oblivious to the undercurrents. "Oh, Martin works so hard. Evelyn, you should be proud of such a diligent husband." I forced a smile, my resolve hardening. "Yes, I'm very proud." The next day, while Martin was at work and his parents were out shopping, I met with a lawyer. I laid out everything. The infidelity, the emotional neglect, the way Martin and his parents treated me. The lawyer listened intently, offering advice and outlining the next steps. "You have a strong case, Evelyn, especially with the evidence of the affair," he said, his tone professional yet sympathetic. I nodded, a sense of empowerment growing within me. "Thank you. I want to proceed with this as soon as possible." That night, I lay in bed, the plan crystallizing in my mind. I would confront Martin, but not yet. First, I would ensure everything was in place for the divorce. I wanted him to feel the full impact of his actions, to realize he couldn't just discard me like an old piece of furniture. The day of reckoning came sooner than expected. On Friday, as Martin prepared for his supposed business trip, I found the proof I needed, a receipt for a romantic getaway at a luxury resort, tucked carelessly in his coat pocket. That evening, with Martin's parents in the living room and Lily asleep, I confronted him. "Going on a business trip, Martin, or should I say a romantic getaway with Rachel?" Martin froze, the color draining from his face. "Evelyn, How did you?" I waved the receipt in front of him. "You're not as clever as you think, Martin. I know everything." For a moment he seemed lost for words. Then his expression hardened. "You've been snooping around, haven't you? You're pathetic." "Pathetic?" The word echoed in my mind, fueling my anger. "No, Martin. What's pathetic is you sneaking around, betraying your family. But I'm done playing the dutiful wife. I'm filing for divorce." Martin's eyes widened in shock. "Divorce? You can't do that. You're nothing without me." I met his gaze, my voice steady. "No, Martin, it's you who will be nothing without me. I have evidence of your affair. I'll make sure you pay for what you've done." For a moment, he looked defeated, but then his arrogance returned. "You think you can win against me? I'll fight you every step of the way." I smiled, a cold, determined smile. "Bring it on, Martin. You'll see just how strong I can be." As I left the room, Martin's stunned silence was a victory in itself. But this was just the beginning. The real battle was about to start. The days following my confrontation with Martin were a whirlwind of legal preparations and silent battles. Martin's demeanor had shifted. He oscillated between anger and a feigned indifference, but I could see the underlying panic in his eyes. The weekend arrived, and with it, an unexpected development. Martin's parents decided to extend their stay, that unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface of our seemingly calm household. One afternoon, as I was tending to Lily in the living room, Martin and his parents cornered me. "Evelyn, we need to talk about your behavior," Martin began, his voice dripping with disdain. Miriam nodded in agreement. "Yes, dear. We've noticed you've been quite distant and cold. It's not becoming of a wife and mother." Gerald added, "Martin has been nothing but a good husband. You should appreciate him more." Their words were like daggers, but I stood my ground. Appreciate him? For what exactly? For his lies? His affair? Martin's face turned red with anger. "Don't bring that up in front of my parents." "Why not, Martin? They should know the kind of son they've raised," I shot back, my voice firm. Miriam gasped. "An affair? Martin, is this true?" Before Martin could respond, I continued, "Yes, it's true, and I'm not going to stand for it anymore. I've filed for divorce." The room fell into a stunned silence. Martin looked at me, his eyes full of malice. "You'll regret this, Evelyn. You're nothing without me." I met his gaze, unwavering. "No, Martin, I regret the years I spent tolerating your arrogance and disrespect. I'm taking Lily and I'm leaving." Martin's parents started to protest, but I didn't let them. "This is between Martin and me. You've overstayed your welcome. It's time for you to leave." As I packed my bags, I could hear the muffled arguments in the background, Martin trying to explain himself to his incredulous parents. I felt a surge of satisfaction, knowing that his perfect image was shattered. With Lily in my arms, I walked out of the house that had become my prison. I didn't look back. I was finally free from Martin's shadow, ready to start anew. As I drove to my parents' house, I thought about the future. It wouldn't be easy, but I was determined to rebuild my life, for Lily and for myself. Martin and his parents would learn that I was not a woman to be underestimated. The next few weeks were a blur of legal meetings and emotional upheaval. Despite Martin's attempts to intimidate me, I stood strong. The evidence of his affair was undeniable, and soon the divorce proceedings were in my favor. The day the divorce was finalized, I felt a mix of relief and triumph. I had stood up to Martin and his oppressive family, and I had won. But my revenge didn't end there. Martin's affair had not only cost him his marriage, but also his reputation. His colleagues and friends learned of his indiscretions, and his once untouchable status crumbled. As for his parents, they were left to grapple with the reality of their son's actions. Their attempts to reach out to me were met with silence. They had lost a daughter-in-law who had once cared for them, all because of their blind support for Martin. I had emerged from this ordeal stronger and more resilient. I had fought for my dignity and won. And as I looked at Lily playing happily in her grandmother's arms, I knew that I had made the right decision. For the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful about the future. I had closed a painful chapter in my life, and a new one was just beginning. In the months following the divorce, my life underwent a transformation. The chains of a loveless marriage had been broken, and in their place, I found a newfound sense of freedom and self-worth. With Lily by my side, I started to rebuild our lives, piece by piece. One day, as Lily played in the garden of my parents' home, I received a phone call that marked the final chapter in my saga with Martin. It was Laura, her voice a mix of shock and concern. "Evelyn, have you heard about Martin?" "No. What happened?" I asked, a sense of foreboding settling over me. "He's lost his job. After the divorce and the affair came to light, his company let him go. And it gets worse. He's been struggling financially. The alimony, the legal fees, it's all caught up with him." I paused, absorbing the news. A part of me felt a pang of vindication, but it was overshadowed by a sobering realization of the consequences of his actions. "And his parents?" I found myself asking. "They're in a tough spot, too," Laura continued. "Without Martin's support, they've had to downsize. It seems they're finally understanding the repercussions of their behavior." I ended the call with a heavy heart. Despite everything Martin had put me through, I found no joy in his downfall. It was a stark reminder of how one's actions could have far-reaching consequences. In the weeks that followed, I focused on Lily and our new life. We spent our days surrounded by the love and support of my parents, who had welcomed us with open arms. One afternoon, as I watched Lily play, my mother sat beside me. "Evelyn, you've grown so much through all of this. You're strong, my dear, stronger than you ever realized." I smiled, squeezing her hand. "Thanks, Mom. It's been a hard road, but I've learned a lot about myself." "And Lily is thriving," she added, watching her granddaughter with a tender gaze. "She's happy, and that's what matters most." As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the garden, I reflected on the journey that had brought me here. The pain, the betrayal, the fight for my dignity, it had all led to this moment of peace and contentment. I knew there would be challenges ahead, and questions from Lily about her father as she grew older. I would face them head-on, with honesty and strength. For now, I was content in the knowledge that I had stood up for myself and my daughter, and we had emerged stronger for it. I looked at Lily, her laughter ringing through the air, and I felt a surge of hope. Our future was unwritten, a blank canvas ready to be filled with new memories and experiences. And for the first time in a long time, I looked forward to seeing what each new day would bring.